finish up, but we'll do what we have to do. It's been a great quarter with you guys, and thanks for listening. We appreciate your attention. We appreciate your comments, your questions. Hopefully, you've been able to take something away from this class, chapter 1 through 30 of Genesis, that maybe you hadn't thought about before. I know for sure I have. I'm sure Kevin and Josh would echo that as well. We have a lot to get through tonight, so let's just get right into it. We're in Genesis chapter 30. If you want to scan the QR code, the notes are at that link. There's also a paper copy of the notes in the foyer if you'd like a paper copy. So, as we've mentioned several times up to this point, Jacob is still not at a point in his faith where he's relying on the Lord for spiritual guidance, and certainly not for worldly or physical guidance either. He's relying on his own devices, as we're going to see in chapter 30. We'll see it a little bit further as we get further into Genesis next quarter, but he does eventually come to the point where he trusts in God rather than his own wisdom. But these particular stories in chapter 30 will give us a little bit more detail about Jacob and his family, his wives, multiple wives, a lot of children. We get introduced to the rest of the children besides Benjamin tonight. There's a lot of turmoil in this family. And there's probably so much more that could have been written about this family that we don't have written. The details that we do have written are enough to see that. And the turmoil is just another, I think, God's way of showing that this is not what God intended for Jacob to live how he wanted him to live his life. So we'll get into that here in a little bit to kind of unravel what I'm referring to there. Jacob's wives that are sisters clearly have some considerable drama going on between them. We'll look at a couple examples of that tonight. Jacob is working for an uncle that has already tricked him once. He's going to trick him again in this chapter. Probably continues to trick him as we go forward on things that we don't even have written. But again, the main point is Jacob is not leading his family in the way that he should. And he's relying on his own devices. And this is where we leave off in this quarter. So kind of a cliffhanger for Steve and Ethan as they pick up in chapter 31. They'll get to bring the good news later of how Jacob comes along in his faith. So, I just realized I don't have the clicker. I don't think the clicker's back here, so. Hopefully Josh didn't take it with him. I might just have to rely on you, Tom, if you don't mind. If you can click through for me, that'd be awesome. Appreciate that. So, we're going to start reading the text. Let's get into verse 1. We're in Genesis chapter 30. We'll read the first two verses, and whenever you can, if you can just forward to the next slide, that would be great. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Okay, so this diagram here is all of Jacob's children on the bottom row and all of his wives on the top row, okay? So he's got 4 wives, Leah, Rachel, and 2 concubines, 1 concubine for each sister, as we'll get through the text as we learn. And then here's all the respective children. I wanted to put this up here now because there's a lot of names to go through, a lot of names to keep track of. We've only been introduced to a few of them so far up to this point, but I thought it was a helpful diagram to show all the different children and the different wives to keep everybody straight. Okay, so we see in verse 1, Rachel envies Leah. She has children. Rachel does not. And recall from chapter 29, verse 30, it specifically states that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. Okay, so that much is clear. It's clear to us. It would have been clear to them. Okay, and Leah yearns for a better relationship with her husband. She doesn't get it as far as we know. Rachel continues to be the favorite wife throughout the rest of their lives as far as we're aware. Thanks, buddy. So, also recall from chapter 29 that Leah had already borne 4 sons, okay? That was right at the end of chapter 29 there. So, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, okay? And Judah is the son where the promised son, Jesus Christ, comes through, obviously. But again, Rachel is barren. Leah has the sons, okay? So one would think, okay, Leah's got the children. She's the favorite. But that's not the case. Rachel still remains the favorite wife, okay? And through the naming of the children, as Josh kind of mentioned on Sunday, Leah names her children in a way that she yearns for that better relationship with her husband. And I think she comes to a point in her faith where she realizes, fine, I'll just, deal with it myself. I'll be my own woman, sort of thing, is the way I see it. By the time she names Judah, it's her mentality has changed a little bit. Verse 2, we see that Jacob is livid at Rachel for her insinuation that it's his fault that they're barren, that Rachel is barren. At least he interprets it that way, in my opinion, that she's insinuating that her lack of children is Jacob's fault. He already has 4 sons with Leah, so he basically chirps right back, do you think I'm God? Is it my fault that you don't have children? That's quite a claim to make. So clearly they're bickering amongst themselves. There's jealousy between the sisters. The story is clearly setting the tone for what's about to happen, okay? So we'll get into verse 3 now. Let's read down through verse 8. Then she said, here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. And Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. Okay? So a lot to unpack here. Rachel has what appears to be given up on the fact that she's barren, but she's still going to do something about, not given up completely, but she realizes she may not have children herself. So she has a very similar mindset to Sarah as she did with Hagar in chapter 16. So when Sarah realized that she may be barren, I've got to have a child. God promised that we were going to have a child of promise, so I've got to do something. They took it into their own hands, and of course Abraham agreed to it, right? Same thing happens here. So the apple hasn't fallen too far from the apple tree 2 apples ago, if you will. This family continues to make repeat mistakes, even that their forefathers had made. So same train of thought that Sarah had about Hagar's child would be her child, and then we see how that plays out, that she wants nothing to do with Ishmael by the time the story's over. She wants them out after he bothers her, Ishmael does something that bothers her, and she kicks them out. So anyway, we see Bilhah conceives 2 sons. First one is Dan. The same thing that we saw in chapter 29, the children's names are kind of a play on words. Dan sounds like the Hebrew word for judged. Okay? So Rachel says, God has judged me. Again, the naming of the children continues to be significant in the story for how these women are interpreting their situations. Okay? Verse 7 and 8. Bilhah has a second son with Jacob. Rachel would have claimed this son to be her own. With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and prevailed. Ironic that she thinks that because it's not really her children that she's bearing, but they are her children through her concubine, right? So she considers this a victory, that she's finally getting children, and she is. So again, now we're to the point where there's at least 6 sons now And we're going to just keep steadily increasing that. Let's read verse 9 through 13, and then after I get through 13, I'll open it up in case anyone has any comments or questions.
Dan, I
Yes,
just want to say, on verse 1 right there, when she says, give me children or else I die.
Yeah.
It's kind of ironic, because she does die in the childbirth with Benjamin. That we see
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, good point.
And in verse 3, she introduces concubinage in the patriarchal family that we see. So there's a lot that she brings in, and then we'll see her pagan ways that she brings in with the mandrakes. So it's just kind of where she
Yeah.
kind of falls into there.
Yeah, good point. Yes, certainly didn't mean to overlook that part of verse 1 where she says, give me children or I shall die, right? It's quite a statement that she makes there, but certainly, yeah, good point, Joe. So let's read verse 9 through 13. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, good fortune has come. So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for women have called me happy. So she called his name Asher. Okay? So Leah had taken a short break from having children with Jacob up to this point, but then she sees that Rachel starts having children through her concubine, and clearly she sees this as a challenge to her to her stature with Jacob, and she's not going to have that. So she ends her childbearing hiatus, even though they're not her children. She gives her concubine Zilpah to Jacob to have more children. Okay, so the first one named Gad, which sounds like the word for good fortune in Hebrew. Remember, she says good fortune has come. And then in verses 12 through 13, the second son Zilpah has is named Asher, which sounds like the Hebrew word for happy. Okay, so continuing these play on words that may not essentially mean, they may not mean what that word sounds like, but they sound like that word. Okay, so maybe a double meaning there in that way. But Leah continues to express her emotions via the naming of her sons as she did in the previous chapter. Okay, she's yearning for her husband's love, and then she finally, like I said, with Judah, she gave up on that. She praised God whenever Judah was born. So I'll pause there for any comments or questions. Anything anyone wants to share before we go any further? Okay. All right. So let's get into the next part of the text. Let's read verses 14 through 18. I've got a couple of them up on the screen there, but we'll go a little bit further. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. Okay, so before we go any further, a little bit I want to get into there. Obviously, there's a lot there, right? So Reuben is the oldest son, can't be much older than 6 or 7 years old at this point, right? They're still in that 7 years of service that Jacob is working for Laban. So the second round of 7 years after he has married Leah. So then he gets Rachel in 7 days after that. So at the time of this story, and even up until close to modern times, embarrassingly enough, it was believed that mandrakes increased a woman's fertility. The mandrake root was also thought to have other health benefits at the time. Song of Solomon chapter 7 actually references, verse 13, Song of Solomon 7:13 references mandrakes. That's the only other reference to mandrakes that I could find. There may have been another one, but I searched all through to see if there was another. But it's not a commonly referred to herb or root, but it is mentioned again by Solomon. And it does kind of further that belief that at the time, the mandrakes would have held some sort of mystical or magical power to aid in fertility or performance. Oddly enough, as we know, science and research have furthered a lot of things since Bible times, and not everything that was thought in Bible times is true, but this is certainly one of those. Many mandrake species are poisonous. So, not all of them, but a lot of them, right? So, ironic that Rachel would have wanted to partake in something that may not have that great of health benefits for her. When it's ingested, I found that it can cause adverse effects like blurred vision, hallucinations, dizziness, headaches, increased heart rate, diarrhea, vomiting, the list goes on and on. So not something that you would want to mess around with today, but certainly back then the belief was this might help you with increasing your fertility. But I just thought that was interesting. The mandrake root is also a strong narcotic and a sedative commonly used in Europe, so it is still used today by some cultures. Benefits of it consuming remain kind of inconclusive. I know I sound like an infomercial for medical, but I just thought this was interesting information. So it kind of helps set the story that, this isn't something that she should have wanted to partake of, but kind of to Joe's point, she was very eager to partake of it. With all that being said, right, regardless of if there's benefits for it or not, no one in this story is trusting in God. That's the main thing to take away. She's not praying to God for guidance. How can I have children? When Abraham and Sarah would have done that, and Isaac and Rebekah certainly did that, praying for their children. But there's no prayer happening here. So certainly consuming this would not have been a beneficial thing for her. I did want to pull up so the picture on the left, I had to throw that in there. I texted Josh last night. If you're a Harry Potter watcher, you know what this is. If you don't, that's okay. You don't need to know. And I'll be the first guy that brings sorcery into the church building. I apologize for that. I'm sure the elders will come talk to me later. But so when you search mandrakes on the internet, that's the first picture that pops up, is mandrakes from Harry Potter. But what they really look like is more on the right? They get their name because they're an herb that looks like a man, right? They look like the body of a human. So it would have been interesting to pull one of these out of the ground back in that time. Maybe I would have thought they would have had some sort of mystical powers myself. But as we get into verse 15, Leah doesn't part with the mandrakes easily. She snaps back at Rachel. You took away my husband, and now you want to take away my son's mandrakes? So clearly Leah is standing her ground on what she can, because she doesn't have Jacob like Rachel does. So I did find that interesting that, Rachel is begging for something that may or may not give her the benefits that she's seeking, but there's some bitterness between these sisters, clearly. So Rachel sees the bitterness and compromises, right? She's so desperate to improve her fertility and have a child with Jacob, she's willing to consume this thing that is poisonous, maybe, and she's willing to allow her husband to sleep with Leah in exchange for the mandrakes, okay? So I don't want to overlook that, as we see in verse 15 and 16, right? She's so willing to trade what the Lord has blessed her with her husband. Clearly, a very peculiar situation, right? A very odd family dynamic going on here. And then in verse 16, we see that Leah is eager to take Rachel up on the trade, accepts it with no debate, gives Rachel the mandrakes, and waits for Jacob in the field until he comes back from working that day, okay? And tells him, I've hired you away from my sister. You're sleeping with me tonight, okay? Just a very odd situation. Jacob is not letting the Lord guide his life at this point, right? Very clear to see that. Then in verse 17, 18, God listens to Leah. Don't want to overlook that as well. Leah is blessed with another son, a fifth son of her own, and says, God has given me my wages. She gives him Issachar. Okay, she names him Issachar, which sounds like the Hebrew word for hired or wages. Okay, which is just even further ironic because Leah's husband is the one that she's having these children with, right? So it's just odd, just very odd situation. Meanwhile, Rachel gets the mandrakes, and as far as we can tell, doesn't have a son. She does not have a son until later in the story, right? So the mandrakes don't do what she wants them to do. So let's get in the next part of the text, verse 19 through 24. Leah conceived again. She bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about this, and then the story kind of takes a shift to a whole nother direction. But definitely want to talk a little bit about this before we go any further. So Leah has her 6th son and still naming the children in a way that, is hopeful that she'll get the honor and the love that she wants from her husband. Zebulun, which is, it sounds like the Hebrew word for honor. Verse 21, Leah has a daughter, Dinah. Obviously, we won't get into this story later, but chapter 34, Dinah will be a central character in 34. So I'm sure they'll hit on that story pretty hard. It's a critical story for the family of Jacob later on. But it's interesting that there's only one daughter named. It's very ironic that they have 12 sons. There's 12 sons, but only one daughter up to this point. It makes you wonder, are there any other daughters? But because one daughter's mentioned, I think we're forced to believe there may not have been any other daughters. But I don't know. It doesn't really matter. Verse 22, God remembers Rachel and blesses her with an open womb. Okay? So a distinction from the previous section where it talks about she's obtaining these mandrakes with the hope that she can have children of her own. No, God makes it very clear it's not because of that she has children. It's after there's other children that are born that God opens her womb and gives her children of her own. Okay? This shouldn't be overlooked because it shouldn't be overlooked that God takes notice of Rachel either. She has children with concubines. She's tried the mandrakes. Who knows what else she tried? We don't have, maybe there's other things not recorded that she would have tried to have children. But God was the only one that could have blessed her with children. And Rachel, this was an opportunity for Rachel and her faith to understand that. But at this point, Leah has 6 sons, and the daughter as well. Bilhah has 2 sons. Zilpah has 2 sons. And based on the reading of this text, this all takes place within a 7-year span. Okay, so Jacob has 12 children, because Benjamin is not born yet. 12 children in the span of 7 years with 4 different women. Okay, so clearly these pregnancies would have overlapped with the others. These children would have been very, very close in age. All of them would be within 7 years. As a father of one young one with another one on the way, the first thing that came to my mind when I read this story was, Jacob, you're insane to think that was a good idea. Man. So, but hey, maybe it worked out well for them. Who knows? But verse 23 and 24, Rachel says, God has taken away my reproach. You got something, Kenny. I know you do. Go ahead. You're doing the...
Look, I mean, the thing about it is that why would Moses put this story in here? And the dysfunctional family that Jacob came from, suddenly there are 12
Yeah.
grandchildren. So this is the way that God works. Is this the way that Abraham probably would have seen this happening? No way.
Yeah.
This is God working through a dysfunctional family. And one of the other things that you see, every one of these sons, who are they giving credit to? God has judged me.
Mhm.
God has made me happy. They keep on giving credit to God. Their relationship to God actually seems to be pretty good. Do they pray to him? I don't know. None of us do.
Sure.
I think one of the things that's going on here is it's kind of like God in our lives. Boy, we want God to be in our lives exactly the way we want God to be in our lives.
Yeah.
But that's not how that works. It's often easier to see God in the rearview mirror than it is in the windshield.
Yeah.
Because God often works in our lives that we can see in retrospect, but not in the present. I think that's what's ahead. And I think this is all going to come to head. When Jacob starts wrestling with God, and God lets him win. I think there's a lot in that story. Jacob has all the problems that he should have had at this point.
Yeah.
But these are all also great blessings because Laban's going to recognize, I keep on getting a lot of good luck when you're here.
Yeah.
And you have an incredible family.
Yeah.
We're seeing the problems. Everybody else is seeing the blessings.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, certainly don't want to overlook the fact that they would have been very thankful to have their children. Definitely not at all what I'm trying to insinuate. But the means by which the children are brought about and the avenue is certainly not probably how God would have wanted it. But God again makes his plan come to fruition regardless of how men make their decisions. And we've seen that so many times in this class already.
This is what God wanted to happen.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't disagree. I think it's an interesting thought, right? But I do have to go back to Genesis. I can't even think of the chapter where 2 or 3, right? Whenever marriage is introduced, right? The marriage covenant is introduced, right? My only thing I would say is that God certainly allowed this to happen, and we see no judgment. We see no judgment, right? God makes this work, and certainly your point about the women, their faith would have been there, right? But maybe kind of to Joe's point, maybe Rachel wasn't where she needed to be in her faith, right? But she gets there. Speculation on my part, certainly, but yeah, I don't disagree with what you've said. Interesting to think about. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to kind of shift direction for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think sometimes we forget how young Rachel and Leah would have been in the story. I mean, these were young women. These are like 18 to 22-year-olds. These are not mature adults, and their sole purpose and their culture was to bear children.
Yeah.
And so the pressure that would have been on them to produce sons, I cannot imagine being that young trying to manage a household at this competition, the pressure that would have been going on between them is astronomical.
Sure.
And when that is what they value and see as their worth, it makes the situation for Rachel much more weighty. She would have had Jacob's adoration, but that didn't matter in that culture, right? If she had nothing to show for it, it was worth nothing, in the household.
Yeah.
It didn't give her any standing in the household. And so I think sometimes we put them of like, why couldn't they have a better faith? Or why couldn't they have seen the bigger picture? But they're so young, I just can't fathom what was actually happening, how awful that would have been, and how hostile of an environment it would have made, even for the concubines.
Yeah, agreed. And you hit on something interesting that we're going to get into in the next part of the story, which is right after this is when Jacob approaches Laban to say, I'm done. I'm ready to do my own thing, right? So that's a great point that, in that day and age, women's value was brought through having children. Your point was great that it wasn't about being loved. Even though she was the loved wife, she didn't have children. So what are we even talking about? There's no she's going to stay with Laban if she doesn't have children, right? Jacob's not going to be allowed to take her away. So it is interesting, the timing of Jacob's request. That gets us right in to the next part of the story. That's a good lead in, unless there's any other comments or questions on the first 24 verses before we go any further. Okay, cool. So let's get into the next part of the text. Enough of the Harry Potter. Verse 25 through 31, we'll read that very quickly. So as soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, again, this is right after that, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages and I will give it." Jacob said to him, "You yourself know how I have served you, and how your livestock has fared with me, for you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now when shall I provide for my own household also?" He said, "What shall I give you?" Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it." Okay, so we'll get into the next part of the text. I wanted to get through verse 31 first before we get into the final part of the chapter. But again, this is immediately after Joseph is born. Rachel has her first child of her own, and Jacob goes and approaches his father-in-law to say, "I'm ready for my indentured servitude to be concluded to you," right? So he's ready to move on and start taking care of his own estate. He wants to go back to his home country, probably wants to get back to his parents, probably wants to enjoy his inheritance that he earned 14 years ago, right? So no things that we should overlook, certainly, right? But Rachel has finally gotten her wish from verse 1 that we talked about. She wanted a child. She's blessed with a child, okay? So, and she said she would die. Well, that's not going to happen. She's finally had a child of her own, right? Verse 26, Jacob asks Laban if he can take his wives and children and be done with this service. Again, like I said, he's ready to start looking to his own retirement. He's been helping Laban earn his retirement, and he even gives Laban a shot, a subtle shot there of, you had nothing before I came here to serve you. I'm the one who earned you everything, more or less, right? I'm certainly insinuating that, but that's what I gather from the text, that he's saying, you had very little before I came. I helped you earn what you have. And Laban admits that. He's willing to hear Jacob out. He admits that the growth of his wealth is primarily due to the Lord blessing Jacob's service. And that's a nice nod to Jacob's work ethic, certainly. So he was a hard worker, which we'll come back to that later. Note the part where it says Laban learned by divination. That's what the English Standard Version says. I took note of a couple other versions here, compared them to see how this was written. There were a ton of different wordings for this. This is a very odd thing to translate from Hebrew, I gather. I have interpreted an omen. I've discovered a divine sign. I have observed the signs. Divination was used a lot. Divined, right? There were so many different translations of this text. But the point remains, Laban was probably not a follower of Jehovah God. Okay, he was looking for signs. He was looking for omens, spiritual signs of some sort, mystical signs. He would have probably been a polytheistic individual. And not to speculate here, but I certainly, as I read this text, I couldn't help but think if this was Laban's attempt to butter up Jacob and his God, and say, oh, your God has blessed you better than my God's blessed me. Couldn't help but think if that's maybe the avenue he was going. But regardless, he gives credit to Jacob here, right? Your God has blessed you and he's blessed me, right? And I have certainly enjoyed that. Laban says, name your wages and I'll pay it. As we'll see later in the story, he will, but he certainly doesn't intend to do it fairly. Jacob piggybacks off of Laban's compliment and gives himself credit. Yeah, it was because of me that you were as successful as you are, essentially. You had very little before I came here. But again, Jacob has 12 children and 4 wives to look after. He needs to start thinking about his own future, okay? So the bargain begins to be struck here in verse 31. What shall I give you? Jacob says, nothing. But here's what I propose that we do, okay? So due to limited time, I am going to summarize verse 32 through 43. Certainly go read it on your own time. My summarization won't do it justice, but it is a very interesting story. I'll do my best to summarize it in a short time. But essentially, Jacob tells Laban, I will work for you a little bit longer. We learn in chapter 31, not to steal Steve and Ethan's thunder, that it's 6 more years that he ends up working for him. So it's a total of 20 years that Jacob works for Laban. Okay? Jacob says, look, I don't need anything. I'm going to earn my wages. Okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I'll take the black and speckled and spotted sheep and the spotted and speckled goats from the flock. That will be my payment, my wages. Okay? Now, black sheep and spotted goats are uncommon. Now we have better genetic modification tools. We can, finagle animals to be what we desire to a certain extent. But back then, they didn't have those kind of tools that we have today, right? So, he also says this. So that, again, this would have been Jacob's attempt to propose a deal tipped significantly in the favor of Laban, okay? Giving him a deal he can't refuse, right? And hoping that he would accept it with no hesitation, which he certainly does. This is no funny business, okay? If you've heard anything about me, I have no intentions of robbing you. If I take any others beyond the ones that I've just described, let them be counted as stolen. I'm ready to be done with my service to you, is the way that I read this, right? He's so eager to be done serving Laban and start looking to his own estate. Okay, Laban accepts the proposal. Then he has his sons remove those types of animals and get them out of Dodge 3 days away from the rest of the flock. Okay, Jacob remained and pastured the rest of the flock and begins his servitude for 6 years. Okay, so Laban tilts the odds in his favor significantly after it's already been significantly tilted in his favor. Genetically, since those types of sheep had been removed, I know that, I'm no geneticist. I'm not an expert in that, but certainly, sheep and goats can still, be different colors if they, if the genetic strand is there, they can do that. But this isn't a genetics class, so we're not going to go down that route. There would have been very low chance on Jacob's own devices for this plan to be successful. Okay, Jacob doesn't think to pray for success or for help. Again, I'm speculating maybe he did, maybe he certainly did. But he certainly takes matters into his own hands with this plan and consults something else. And I don't want to overlook this, right? He very well could have prayed, but I would have a hard time believing it because of what happens here, right? He takes matters into his own hands, and a common belief of men at the time was that if you want to reproduce sheep and goats of a certain color, you have them look at something that is that color, okay? There's no science behind that, certainly, but that's what he thought could make that work, right? So I'm not going to sit here and say Jacob did not pray and did not have faith in God. I certainly would not do that, but I would say that this is maybe a lacking faith moment, that he's resorting to the beliefs of the day, the omens of the day. Oh, if you put a stick in front of your animals, they'll look like that whenever they conceive their baby sheep and goats, right? But sure enough, Laban's flocks conceived black, speckled sheep and spotted goats. But that wasn't because Jacob's conspiracy theory was correct. It was because God had the power to control the genetics of the animals, and he blessed Jacob with those types of animals that he wanted to reproduce, that he proposed to Laban. So definitely not something we want to overlook. Verse 42, notice it says the feebler of the flock would be Laban's and the stronger would be Jacob's. Okay, so Jacob increased greatly and had large flocks, female and male servants, camels and donkeys, And at the end of this 20-year service, Jacob is a very wealthy man. He has made something of himself. And he hasn't even gone home to control his own inheritance yet. So we haven't seen the end of his successes. But, and Josh made this point in his notes, so if you disagree with it, that's on Josh, not me. But I thought it was a good point. His wealth has grown strictly because of his own devices, not because it doesn't mention God at all, besides the fact that Laban does draw attention to God's help in, whatever verse that was. The Lord has blessed me because of you, right? So Jacob certainly was blessed by God. So that's all I have. Any comments or questions? Yeah, go ahead, Kenny.
I'd say one of the things, God, the only reason that Joseph is, Jacob's father, is because God is a target, and his blessings are making him a target. And that's going to happen with Joseph, his
Sure.
youngest son as well.
Yeah.
The blessing, no matter where he puts himself in a really bad position, God keeps on blessing him,
Yeah,
and that makes him a target.
sure.
Jacob keeps on getting blessed. He keeps on getting a larger family. He keeps on amassing more wealth, almost in spite of himself.
Yeah,
And that's making him a bigger and bigger target.
Yeah.
And that's going to make him irreconcilable with his father-in-law. And he's already irreconcilable from his brother.
yeah,
So now he's going to be on the lam from his father-in-law, and he's going to be running into the arms of somebody who has promised to kill him.
yeah,
And that is of his own making.
yeah.
And God keeps on blessing.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Kenny made the point earlier that is one of the main points that we've been trying to drive home this entire quarter is God is using this imperfect family, I'll come to you in a second, Eric, sorry, to bring about his plan, okay? And no matter what men would do, God always found a way to make his plan come to fruition. He does it today, he did it then. He's never failing in that way. Go ahead, Eric.
To your point, and this will occur in Exodus and several times in the Old Testament, even Stephen will recall it in Acts 7. God will introduce himself to Moses and says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
I find that fascinating. It's a historical reminding the people of who this God is that now appears to Moses. But I find it interesting. Abraham, we think, okay, yeah, it's not Abraham, it's Abraham. Isaac was the son of promise. Okay, we get that. But Jacob? Okay.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, Jacob will have a transformation later on. That's next quarter,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It begins really a little bit in chapter 31. But it's to your point. God is referring to himself as these are the patriarchs. And this guy, as dysfunctional as he was and his family was, is who I use to make you a great nation.
Sure.
It's all about me, not about Jacob, not about
Sure.
these guys.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good comments. Thank you for your discussions. That is the end of our time together, but I do hope that you guys have been able to take something away from this quarter, and thanks for suffering through my first time teaching in the auditorium, and thanks to Josh for the opportunity. So if you didn't enjoy it, you can talk to him and blame him, but thank you. I appreciate that. Steve Crawford and Ethan Parker will be picking up where we left off, chapter 31. Thank you.